Welcome to the 8th of this series of 12 lessons on In the Beginning, looking at the first 11 chapters of Genesis. In our last lesson, we were introduced to Noah. While conditions on the earth were going from bad to worse, Noah stuck out because he was different. He was faithful to God. Because of the wickedness of the earth, God determined to destroy his creation. But because Noah was faithful, God would spare him and his faithful family. God gave him instruction to construct a large boat so that he and his family, as well as representative animals, would be spared the extinction that was about to happen. And God would start over with all that were on the ark. Noah did exactly what God told him to do. It would seem that it took about 100 years to build this huge boat. In the next chapter of Genesis, where we're going to be in this lesson, in chapter 7, we have the details of the ark being stocked with the animals and food, and then the flood arrived. An outline for this chapter might be something like this. First 5 verses, Noah was given instructions about the animals, told to take them into the ark. Verses 6 down to 10, Noah and his family and the animals entered the ark. Verses 11 through 16, the flood began. And verses 17 through 24, all who were living on the earth perished. God told Noah to take his family into the ark because he had seen that Noah was righteous in that generation. Now, this could be seen in Noah's simply obeying God's command to build the ark. But it was other parts of his life as well. We have no evidence that God had communicated to Noah since that original command to build the boat some 100 years earlier. If there had been no other communication, this says quite a bit about Noah's faithfulness. God gave Noah further commands about the animals he was to take with him. He was to take 7 pairs of clean animals. Now, the Hebrew could also mean 7 animals, 3 pairs plus 1. The Hebrew literally says 7, 7, and that's reflected in the New American Standard Bible footnotes. Those who hold to just 7 clean animals suggest 3 pairs plus 1 male for sacrifice. 7 pairs, though, seems to make more sense to me in the context, since it says a male and its mate. It doesn't allow for one being mateless. Of the unclean animals, it was just to be a pair. The types of animals are distinguished as clean and unclean here in the text, but no explanation given as to what that refers to. We assume it refers to the same distinctions that were given in Leviticus chapter 10. Bill Grasham in his commentary wrote, long before the law of Moses was given, a distinction was already being made between clean and unclean animals and birds. This does not prove, as has been suggested, that later Jewish writers projected back into their past their later Mosaic laws. It emphasizes that very early, God distinguished between those animals and birds that were to be offered as sacrifices, the clean, and those that were unacceptable for sacrifices, the unclean. Now, Moses, if he was compiling this narrative of Genesis while the Israelites were in the wilderness, and I think that makes good sense, then they would have received this command about clean and unclean while he was doing that. So he only has to refer to it, and they would understand what he was talking about. You might think, why more clean than unclean animals? I think the explanation is very simple. The clean ones are the ones offered as sacrifices, which Noah would do when he left the ark. If there were only 2, he would have eliminated a particular animal. The clean ones would also be the ones that they would be allowed to eat following the flood. Again, there would be need for more of them. There would be 7 more days, God told Noah, then the rain would begin, which would last for 40 days and nights. Urgency is seen, but there's still a week to get everything and everyone on board. And we find in the text that Noah obeyed. A question that often comes up concerning the animals of the ark is this one: how could they fit them all into this boat? This is often asked in an effort to show that the Bible just can't be right. I think several observations are worth noting. Number one, they would not take the largest animals. They would want young animals who'd be reaching reproductive age at the end of the year in the ark. A lot more smaller animals than larger ones would fit. And secondly, the ark was not a small boat. It was a huge barge, the largest ever built until the metal ships of the late 19th and 20th centuries. The dimensions of the ark, as we mentioned earlier, have been proven to be very seaworthy, almost impossible to capsize. And there was a lot of space in the ark. If we assumed the cubit was 17.5 inches, then on the 3 decks there were over 95,000 square feet, or almost 1.4 million cubic feet. That's a lot of space for storage. This is the equivalent of 520 modern boxcars of a freight train. And if you keep in mind that most animals are not large, especially if we take the young ones, there was more than enough space for 2 of every species that are alive, plus 7 of the clean, or 14 of the clean, 7 pairs. Although kind does not necessarily refer to species, there are probably a whole lot more species than kinds. And there would still be enough room left over for Noah's family and the supplies for the voyage. In fact, Ken Ham, after doing some calculations, suggested in his answer book, calculations suggest that fewer than 75,000 individual animals would have been needed on Noah's ark, and indicate that these animals could have fitted on only 1 floor of the ark, since their average size would have been no bigger than a sheep. As far as space is concerned, that was not a problem on the ark. There was plenty of space. Ken Ham says that the ark was more than large enough to carry representatives of every kind of air-breathing, land-dwelling animal. Noah was now 600 years old, so 100 years had passed since chapter 5, verse 32, when we were introduced to him. Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, and their wives entered the ark. Notice that although polygamy was already being practiced, Noah and his family did not practice it. Each had 1 wife. The animals came in as well. We don't know how all this worked. I assume it was God sending the animals to Noah, as Hugo McCord in his translation indicated, but rather than Noah and his family having to go out and search for them and round them up. After 7 days, the rain came and the flood began. Bill Grasham wrote, "We're given no details regarding what Noah and his family did during the final 7 days before the flood. But the Hebrew verb translated entered in verse 13 indicates that the family had completed their entry into the ark on the day the rain began. Likely they had spent the last week getting all of the animals, birds, and creeping things situated in their separate compartments and nests, as well as loading the final supplies that would be needed to sustain them for over a year before they could leave the vessel. And I'm quite sure that they had cages, nests, as Bill Grasham had suggested, that would house the animals, probably smaller ones for the smaller animals, and larger ones for the large ones. But it was precisely in the 600th year of Noah, second month, 17th day of the month, that the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the heavens, or the windows of the heavens, were opened. In other words, the flood began. That we have such precise dating of when the flood began points towards this being an actual historic event. Other flood stories from other civilizations don't try to give this much precise details. The fountains of the deep. These were apparently vast subterranean sources of water. These most likely would have triggered seismic and volcanic activity on a wide scale, which would have caused a lot of things to be thrown into the atmosphere, which would have allowed more rain. The windows of heaven, either the ordinary source of rain or extra water that God supplied here, or referring to this vast cloud that would have produced more moisture. Because there had to be something in addition to what our normal rain would be, to have water coming down this much over just over a month, almost a month and a half period, to flood the entire world. It just wouldn't quite work that way without these extra things. And we've had years when there's been a lot more seismic activity, and there've been very dark years which were very cold and were very wet as a result. Although I think the last one of those was in the 1800s. Bill Grasham writes, on the 17th day of the month, a reversal of the original creation began to take place, with the joining once again of the waters above the earth and those below. In this uncreation of the world, the fountains of the great deep burst open. Evidently, the process involved subterranean waters, underground rivers and streams, and possibly geothermal waters that existed underneath the crust of the earth. Vast source of water, and it begins to flood the earth. The rain fell for 40 days and 40 nights. The Hebrew word used here for rain is the word geshem, which indicates a hard, driving rain. In Scotland, we often get very much a mist that comes down, sometimes for days at a time, just drenches everything, but doesn't accumulate as much. This is a hard, driving rain. Most of us have experienced that at some point. Think about that for an extended period, day and night, not a let-up. The day Noah and his family and all the representative animals entered the ark was the day that the rain began. Interestingly, the text also tells us there, or at least reminds us of who the sons of Noah are: Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And we're going to have more of those in the next few chapters. Interesting as well, the sons are mentioned before Noah's wife and the sons' wives, and their names aren't given at all. Bill Gresham wrote this, I like this. Although we know little about the women who were involved in the antediluvian story, we know enough. They were not part of the moral decline that set in with Lamech and continued up to the period prior to the flood. The family of Noah consisted of a total of 8 persons, and the first reference to a godly descendant of Seth, who had more than one wife, does not appear until the story of Abraham. So they seem to be still monogamous in their marriage. Apparently, it took 7 days to load the ark, and God shut the door, sealing them inside. The rain continued for 40 days. The ark floated above the earth on the flood. The text says that it rained 40 days continually, and after that the waters continued to increase. So that increase may have been due to the subterranean sources of water still feeding the flood. Depending on how high the mountains were, it may have even had something to do with the water runoff that was happening there as well. I like this depiction in the Creation Museum. that people will be the ones who found the highest point trying to escape the flood, and yet they couldn't escape it. The waters continued and eventually covered all the mountains to a depth of 15 cubits. That's around 22 feet, or about 7 meters. Some have suggested that this would have been known, the depth would have been known by the draft of the laden ark, because it cleared all obstacles. And as we just mentioned, we don't know what the height of the mountains were at this time. They may not have been as high today, because we have in the Bible, it talks about, and we have this in science as well, that there's a process called isostasy, which the pressure thrusts up the mountains. There's evidence that happened across the world. So this may have happened due to the flood, and the mountains not yet been as high as we have today. One thing we do know is that we find that the tops of the mountains, including Mount Everest, contain water-deposited fossils. This is a photo I took about 2,000 feet up in the Lake District, and on one of the fells there. And you can definitely see shells encrusting this particular rock. Today, it's about 2,000 feet above sea level. It was at one point underwater. And so that tells us that we could even find that evidence in the UK today. But apparently Mount Everest, you'll find the same thing. All the people, all the living creatures died that lived on the earth. Now, aquatic life would have survived, at least some of it. Some burrowing insects might have survived, although they may have been included in the creeping things. Even the freshwater fish could have survived, even with an influx of salt water, because the salt content in the oceans would have been diluted by the addition of the extra water. And plus, it may not have had as high a salinity at this point in time. And fish, by the way, and we know this, adapt quite well to differing levels of salt. We visited the Tennessee Aquarium in Chattanooga, Tennessee, a number of years ago. And what is interesting is they often display saltwater and freshwater fish in the same tank. And they've done that by slowly adjusting it for both and then adding them together. So we can do a lot with the salinity. That's not an issue here at all. The waters continued rising on the earth for 150 days. 40 days of rain plus 110 more days of the water rising. That would be about 5 months. The implication is that after this, the flood began to subside. We find repeatedly in the text the word prevailed. That Hebrew word literally means triumphed. The waters prevailed, the waters triumphed over the earth. That's a Hebrew military word for succeeding in battle. What does that tell us? Humans were losing, and God was winning using the water. Notice that the ark does not just lift off, it travels over the waters. That's what the Hebrew literally says. A chap named Cusato, which is quoted by Gordon Wenham in the Word Biblical Commentary, says the paragraph closes with an awe-inspiring picture of the mighty waters covering the entire earth. We see water everywhere, as though the waters of the deep submerged everything. Nothing remained of the teeming life that had burst forth upon the earth. A few observations about what seems to have happened during the flood. It's thought by leading creation scientists that it was during the flood that the continents began to break up, which will eventually give us the landmass that we know today. Almost every existing civilization has a story preserved about a great flood. There are over 100 different ones that we know about. The most famous being the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's a copy of that on the right of this photo. On the left is the Epic of Atrahasis. These stories vary widely, largely because they were handed down by word of mouth rather than being recorded and preserved in writing. But they all have some similarities. The cause was the moral decay of man. One man with his family was saved. Animals, and in particular birds, played an important role. Nearly all have the survivors landing on a mountain. Some have 8 humans surviving. Some give supplemental information, such as bodies floating on the water like logs. One of the major differences is the names of those who were preserved. Now, we often hear the flood was just a local flood. I may suggest the flood wouldn't have been just a local flood. Water cannot just rise in one area. And we see the absurdity of that in this picture here. And plus, if it were just a local flood, why did you need a big boat? Why did you need to collect the animals? There have been animals in other areas of the world. Noah and his family could have migrated. And there is good evidence that this was a worldwide flood. The Black Sea. From what we can tell, and apparently the science has verified this, used to be fresh water. It's now salt water. To get salt water to go into it meant that the waters had to rise to get over that bit of land which has some mountains on it. You know, the water couldn't have risen just in one area. It should be of note to us, if we believe in Jesus, if we believe the Bible, that the New Testament accepts that this was a worldwide event that destroyed all but 8 people. Jesus mentioned it in Matthew chapter 24, verses 38 and 39. We looked at that in our last lesson. Peter mentioned this. 1 Peter chapter 3, 20 and 21. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 5, we noticed that in our last lesson. And 2 Peter 3, 5 to 7. Let's look at the two from Peter that we've not yet looked at. 1 Peter 3, 20 and 21. At one time they were disobedient when God was patient in the days of Noah, while the ark was being built. In the ark, a few, that is 8 souls, were brought safely through the water. This was a figure of the washing which now saves you, not the removal of dirt from the body, but the earnest request to God for a clear conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In the 3rd chapter of Peter's 2nd letter, we find this. They willfully ignored that by the word of God the heavens were of old, and the earth existed out of water and through water. The world of that time, being submerged in water, perished. But by the same word, the present heavens and earth are reserved for burning at the day of judgment and of the destruction of godless men. So Peter refers 3 times to this as a fact. Jesus himself refers to it as a fact. As far as the Bible is concerned, this is a factual, historic event. 3 major obstacles are usually raised to this event being real. Some have suggested, number 1, that it would have required too much water. Others, the ark was too big to have been built. And thirdly, there were too many animals to have to take. So let's look at those just briefly. Water was not really an issue. If the land didn't have as high mountains or as deep valleys, and everything was relatively uniform, it would take less water. We'll probably look at a bit more of that when we get to chapter 8. And it isn't just rain producing the water. The fountains of the deep, the windows of heaven were opened as well, indicating that this was an extraordinary amount of water. And as Noah had 100 years to build this boat, there had been no problem to construct it. Look at other huge structures that we know were built in the distant past. Man's been able to do that for a long time. And we've already dealt with the number of animals required. We did that earlier in this particular lesson. I would suggest that a worldwide flood is the best explanation of the fossil record. What people sometimes don't realize, if you can see the bottom of this and read it, everything from one source both plants and animals. This, by the way, is Haeckel's drawing of this. But suggests a worldwide flood is a better explanation of this fossil record. For fossils to be formed, they have to be buried quickly in water. The normal interpretation of the geologic record is that the creatures in the lowest level are the oldest, and it took thousands, if not millions of years to lay down the rock layers. Now, we know huge rock layers can be laid down very quickly, with fine layers clearly seen. We know that because it happened in 1980 when Mount St. Helens erupted. It laid down over 20 feet of this type of sediment in a few days, as well as carving out a canyon that's 1/3 the size of the Grand Canyon in a few weeks. If there was a worldwide flood, the creatures first trapped and buried would be the ones that were not as ambulatory, as we find in the fossil record, with the more ambulatory ones being buried later, and man, the one who could reason where to go to try to escape the rising waters, being buried last. If there really was a worldwide flood, what would we expect to see? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. Why? Because of the amount of silt and mud. In fact, as we see here, even fish buried. And we find those all over the earth. What do we see when we look at the fossil record? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. It's exactly what we see. Henry Morris says more and more evolutionary geologists today are returning to the concept of at least local catastrophism for the explanation for all types of geological features and formations. More and more creationist geologists and other scientists are returning to the concept that all these local catastrophes were essentially contemporaneous and continuous, making up a complex which was nothing less than a worldwide cataclysm. Clearly, that cataclysm was the Genesis flood. And Bill Grasham points this out. A straightforward reading of these verses results in acceptance that a universal flood covered all of the mountains, destroyed all living creatures, except for those in the ark. And that's where we're going to leave it for this lesson. The flood is hit. The people, the animals are in the ark. And we'll see what happens after the flood in the next chapter. A couple of lessons that I think are important to emphasize here. First is being this. We see the great faith that Noah and his family had to have. Bill Grasham wrote, from a human perspective, there was no guarantee of success. They only had the Lord's word of promise. Since there were truly uncharted waters where no seafaring person had gone before, Noah and his family needed great faith to place themselves completely in the hands of God as they entered the ark and heard the door close behind them. And a second lesson, God's delay allowed for the people to change and come to him. Again, Bill Grasham. It must have seemed long and wearisome to this faithful remnant as they sought to warn others of the impending judgment, build the ark, and gather the needed supplies to sustain them for the year they would spend afloat on the floodwaters. Most people in the time of Noah had ignored the warning about the flood. Likewise, to Peter's listeners, judgment seems slow in coming because God is not wishing for any to perish, but for all to come to repentance. The same was evidently the case before the flood. That is a characteristic of God. As I said, next week we'll be in chapter 8. We'll look at what happened after the flood. So we hope you can join us for that lesson as well.